Hello, I'm Tom Wilkinson, and welcome to the Thinking in English podcast, a podcast for intermediate to advanced level English learners. 1,000 years ago, the Song Dynasty of China created the most advanced and developed society in the world. It was so advanced that historians have compared it to 18th century Britain. However, unlike 18th century Britain, China did not have an industrial revolution. Let's discuss why on today's episode of Thinking in English. Check out the Thinking in English blog for a full transcript of today's episode. Head over to my Instagram page, Thinking in English Podcast. And as always, the vocabulary list is in the description of the podcast. Here is today's vocabulary list. Skilled. Skilled. Skilled work needs to be done by someone who has had special training. For example, we are recruiting experienced and skilled mechanics to work on a new project. Industry. Industry. The companies and activities involved in the production of goods. For example, the government has recently started listening to the concerns of industry. Manufacturing. Manufacturing. The business of producing goods in large numbers, such as car manufacturing, has increased over the last month. To flourish. To flourish. To grow or develop successfully, as in, the tomatoes in my garden are flourishing due to the warm weather. Dynasty. Dynasty. A series of rulers or leaders who are all from the same family, or a period when a country is ruled by that family. For example, the Mughal dynasty ruled over India for centuries. To observe. To observe. To watch carefully, such as children learn by observing adults. Plague. Plague. So this is usually the bubonic plague, which was a very infectious disease which killed half of all Europeans in the 14th century. As in, millions died of the plague. Printing press. Printing press. A machine that prints text or images, especially for books, newspapers, or other documents. For example, the printing press is one of the most important inventions in history. To kneel. To kneel. To go down into a position where one or both knees are on the ground. For example, the mother knelt down beside her child. Throughout history, there have been, and still are, numerous different ways of structuring and managing an economy. For years, farming was the most common job for the majority of people. People lived in rural areas, growing their own vegetables and raising livestock like pigs or sheep to sell or trade. This is known as an agrarian economy. An agrarian economy is based on the production, trade, and sale of agricultural products. In other words, plants and animals. Moreover, other products, including clothes and tools, were all handmade. Let's think about a pair of shoes, for example. In the past, shoes were generally made by skilled craftsmen. From start to finish, one person cut the leather, made the sole, and shaped the shoe. Each part, each step in the process was done by an individual person. Industrial revolution is the name given to the process of change, major change in a country's economy. A change from such an agrarian and handcrafted economy to an economy dominated by manufacturing and industry. The technological changes of the Industrial Revolution not only result in economic changes, but also fundamentally change the ways of working, living, and transform society. The first country to experience an industrial revolution was Britain in the 18th century. New machines were created to make the process of manufacturing textiles faster and easier. Unlike a skilled person, a machine works for cheaper and without needing to rest. As more machines were developed in other industries, Britain's economy began to fundamentally change. With more products, new ways of moving them around the country were needed, new business owners were getting richer, and people were needed to work in factories instead of on the farm. Let me give you all some more concrete examples of such changes. In terms of technology, iron and steel became the most important materials. New energy sources like coal, the steam engine, and electricity were developed and used. Machines were created which could do the same job as a person. Jobs became specialized. Instead of one skilled craftsman making an entire shoe, different people were responsible for the different parts and assembly of the shoe. Factories became the center of employment. New transportation like the steam train, the steamboat, and the automobile were invented. New communication technology like telegraphs and radios were introduced. And science became part of industry for the first time. Outside of industry, improvements in farming technology meant it was possible to feed people working in factories and living in cities. There was increased international trade, new political movements based on industry, and new government policies based on working class populations. Small villages grew into major cities in just a few years, and people's livelihoods changed. Farmers and skilled craftsmen became machine operators and factory workers. Although the Industrial Revolution started in Britain, it eventually spread to mainland Europe, with the next country to industrialize being Belgium. Like Britain, Belgium's Industrial Revolution was based on coal, steel, and textiles. France followed as well, but much slower and less thorough than the UK. And the rest of the world was even more slow. Germany's Industrial Revolution didn't start until the 1870s. The US also began in the late 19th century, along with Japan, and the Soviet Union, India, and China did not have their first industrial revolutions until the middle of the 20th century. Historians have debated for years why Britain was the first country to industrialize. It's a complex process, and Britain was not the first place or the only place to have such a period of development, progress, and open exchange. However, it was the first industrialized economy. Although I don't necessarily agree with his whole philosophy, Karl Marx claimed that Britain's use of the compass, gunpowder, and printing press allowed the country to undergo the Industrial Revolution. However, nearly 1,000 years earlier, another civilization across the world already used all of that technology. China should have been the first industrial country. 1,000 years ago, while Europe was so weak and backwards that the Middle East and Asia considered it not even worth visiting. China was flourishing with the most advanced civilization in the world. Between the years 960 and 1279, China's Song dynasty came so close to industrialization. In fact, according to the historian Stephen Davies, in key areas of the economy, government, social structure, and intellectual life and scientific investigation, Song China was as close to modernity as 18th century Europe. Before the Song dynasty, China had spent years under constant war, with different regions constantly battling for power with each other. After uniting the country, the Song Emperor Taizu did something unexpected, extraordinary, and historically important. Taizu invited all of his military officers, the people responsible for uniting China, winning the wars, and making him emperor, to a large banquet. At this banquet, he asked all of his generals and military leaders to retire, to go home, and to live peaceful lives. Instead of receiving roles in China's new government, the military went home and civilians took charge of the country. And therefore, the focus of Song China became development rather than war or fighting. At the same time, traders from foreign lands were allowed back into China. In fact, Muslims, Indians, Persians, and Jews were not just welcomed back as traders, but were given important roles in Chinese society. Emperor Taizu even appointed an Arab Muslim as his first astronomer, the scientist responsible for observing the stars and planets, which was very important as China used a calendar based off the moon. Allowing foreign travelers into the country was incredibly important and beneficial. It allowed China to benefit from the knowledge and expertise of people from other parts of the world. India and the Middle East, for example, provided new science and new technology. Better types of rice were imported from Vietnam and Southeast Asia, and Chinese artists and philosophers were inspired by knowledge from other places. It is well documented that the most open countries and the most open societies tend to be the fastest to develop and invent new products. When different cultures, ideas, methods, and knowledge meet, the result is usually technological advances. Hundreds of years before Europe, for example, China was already using a movable printing press, allowing documents to be printed quickly and cheaply. What else did Song China do differently? Well, they invented paper money, as coins became too annoying and too heavy to carry between cities. Paper money made trade much, much easier. And farmers who moved to new land and successfully grew crops were allowed to keep that land and sell it in the future. Land was owned by the farmer, by the individual, not by the emperor or by some noble person like in Europe. China's fleet of trading ships was the best in the world. New roads were built to allow crops and products to be transported to boats and then onto different parts of China or the world. In just a few hundred years, Song China's population and wealth grew massively. In fact, Song China was incredibly close to experiencing an industrial revolution. During the dynasty, businessmen were already experimenting with iron, coal, and textile machines 500 years before anyone in Britain. So, what went wrong? Why was China not the first industrial country? Well, as we know, China didn't industrialize until the middle of the 20th century, literally 1,000 years after the Song dynasty. Song China was so advanced, according to some historians, comparable with 18th century Britain, but something went wrong. It was not a problem with resources. China had materials, they had knowledge, and they had energy. They had more than enough for an industrial revolution. Instead, according to Johann Norberg, it was a problem of politics. The Song dynasty was not always peaceful. Most of northern China was lost in the year 1127, and the smaller country of southern Song was created. 100 years later, the Mongol army began to attack Song territory. And although the advanced Chinese technology allowed Song to defend itself for many years, by 1279, the Mongol forces finally conquered all of China. However, this did not mean the end of Song's ideas and knowledge. Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis, kept much of Song China's society and science. In fact, Mongols even introduced new improvements learnt from their territories across Asia, the Middle East, and Eastern Europe. The famous traveler Marco Polo from Italy, or Venice at the time, was impressed by this China, the China of Kublai Khan. There was even more trade, even more international recruits from across the world, and the Silk Road was once again open after many, many years. The Mongol Empire was one of the greatest and largest empires to ever exist. Then, the bubonic plague, also known as the Black Death, struck. It killed millions of people around the world and ended international trade and caused the loss of much of China's wealth. Rebellions against the Mongol leaders resulted in the Han Chinese Ming dynasty coming to power. The Ming dynasty were embarrassed that China had been controlled by foreign Mongols. They blamed the fall of Song China on the weakness of an open society. So, Ming China decided to be the opposite of Song China. They gave the emperor and government unlimited power, started trade wars with their old partners, and built walls to stop foreigners entering the country. The Ming dynasty actually destroyed many of the new innovations of Song China. People were not allowed to leave their hometowns or cities. Citizens were forced to wear traditional clothes from 500 years earlier, and the Chinese calendar became inaccurate, as the Ming leaders would not employ scientists who knew how to adjust the calendar. Ming China banned private international trade. Foreign languages were made illegal. There was no more religious freedom. And even a few times they banned silver coins. Some historians have described it as an anti-modern revolution. Things got even worse after the fall of the Ming dynasty. The Manchu leaders of the Qing dynasty tried to return China back to the ancient society of Confucius. It was only with the arrival of a foreign Manchu government that China finally became a traditional conservative state. Famously, the Chinese government rejected British trade offers as the Qing government claimed they already had everything they needed. And in 1816, the British representative was sent back to England without any conversation at all, after he refused to kneel in front of the emperor. 1,000 years earlier, Arab traders also refused to kneel in front of the Tang emperor. But that emperor accepted that different cultures had different traditions. Qing China was not so open. You might be thinking right now that the reason Britain and Europe eventually managed to industrialize was because the rulers of the West were more intelligent, open, and encouraging than the leaders of Ming and Qing China. But that's also not true. 18th and 19th century Europe was not more open to technology, and it was not more open to change, definitely not. In 1821, Emperor Francis I of Austria-Hungary told a group of teachers that if any of them comes with new ideas, he can go or I will remove him. Kings and queens across Europe regularly banned new machines and factories, even in places like the UK, Belgium, and France. So, what was the difference between China and Europe? Well, it might shock you to hear, but it was probably that China's leaders were more powerful and were stronger. When Ming China banned new technology, they succeeded. When Ming China banned foreign immigration, they succeeded. When Ming and Qing China wanted to stop new ideas, new knowledge, they succeeded. However, when European countries tried, they failed. The kings and queens of Europe were not as strong as the emperors of China. European leaders tried to ban development and advances in the economy, but they failed. And this is probably part of the reason Europe managed to industrialize when China failed. Ironically, because Europe and their leaders were not as strong. On today's episode of Thinking in English, I have tried to explain why China, Song China to be specific, which was the most advanced society at the time, failed to industrialize. Song China came so close to industrializing hundreds of years before Britain. Song China was a country of innovation, civilian rule, international exchange, and openness. After the Song dynasty ended, everything that made Song China great was replaced by traditional and conservative ideas. And China's strong government meant that they were able to destroy technology and prevent any industrial revolution. This story has meaning in our modern world too. Countries around the world have become increasingly anti-immigration, anti-education, and anti-science. And the result of this is definitely not going to be improvements in technology and innovation. My country, the UK, the US, Eastern European countries like Hungary, Brazil, the Philippines, China, these are just a few countries that have become more resistant to free trade, immigration, or new knowledge over recent years. Hopefully, these countries don't fall into the same trap China did about 800 years ago. What do you think was the reason China did not have an industrial revolution? Why was Britain the first country to have an industrial revolution? Let me know in the comments on the blog, on Spotify, or send me a DM on Instagram. Thank you for listening to today's episode. I really appreciate every single person who takes the time to listen to my podcast. Make sure you head over to the blog, thinkinginenglish.blog, so you can read the whole transcript of today's episode and look at some of the other content I upload onto the blog. You can also check out my Instagram page. I post very regularly, and if you want to message me, I always reply to people on Instagram. Please leave a rating and a review on Apple Podcasts. Leave a rating on Spotify. You can do that now, and I'm trying to get to 150 ratings by the end of February. Please recommend to all of your friends and maybe share on social media. And why not go back and listen to a few of the old episodes? It's one of the best ways to support the podcast. You can also donate on the Thinking in English blog by going to the support page. And yeah, have a great day, and I'll see you next time.